The question of the origin of evil and why humans do evil things has always been one of the most challenging and contentious issues that the great Greek thinkers and philosophers of the classical and Roman age pondered over, and they had some pretty interesting and diverse views and ideas on the subject. But these beliefs were pretty much swept aside by the imposition of Christianity in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. And the early Christians had a much more dramatic and colourful answer to the origin of evil. And that was that a supernatural force, Satan, a fallen angel as he's called, was behind it all and causing the mischief. Let's take a quick look at some of the Greek philosophers' thoughts on the issue before we see how Prudentius, one of the most well-known and well-read Christians of the 4th century in the medieval age, explains the Christian position of an evil entity, Satan, essentially being the instigator for evil amongst us. So both Socrates and Plato speculated that evil was really a consequence of ignorance or uneducation or miseducation, if you like. Essentially, there'd be much less evil actions if we as humanity countered this with increased knowledge and truth and therefore understanding and tolerance of others in the world. Generally, we'd live in a much more enlightened and therefore far less evil world. Put simply, no one willingly pursues evil or wants to do evil things, and education teaches us to handle matters in a much more civilized way. Aristotle, on his part, suggested evil was really a weakness of will. A man may know what is good and bad, but he commits evil because he's too weak to resist doing the act. And the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus suggested evil was essentially a corruption of reason. If everyone used reason and rationale in their actions, we'd have far less evil in this world. Instead, when we fail to use reason, we succumb to feelings, passions and emotions which lead us astray in many cases. Evil, then, is rather an absence of virtue in the same way darkness is an absence of light, and he therefore compares evil to an arrow being fired but missing its mark, the mark being virtue. Quote, "As a mark is not set up for the sake of missing the aim, so neither the nature of evil exists in the world." So some interesting and thoughtful ideas, and there's obviously an element of truth in all these theories. Certainly there were pretty optimistic ways of looking at the issue of evil. The common theme in all this Greek thinking was that the fault and answer lies within us somewhere, that these are human failings and we can address these issues by ourselves, by improving ourselves in one way or the other on the way to becoming more virtuous. So as mentioned, this was completely different from early Christian dogma. So let's see how Prudentius argues from the early Christian angle. But before we start, a quick introduction on Prudentius, or Aurelius Prudentius Clemens to refer to his full name. He was born in 348 in northern Spain and lived during the 4th century when the various Christian emperors were increasing the level of duress and persecution of pagans in order to convert the entire Roman Empire to Christianity. Pagan temples were being closed down and laws were being passed banning pagan practices and worship. So this was a period where Christianity was rapidly assuming the trappings of power and authority over the empire and its people. Prudentius was both a lawyer and a poet and wrote a number of highly influential books, the most famous being Psychomachia, meaning Battle of the Soul, which was one of the most popular and most widely read books of the medieval age. But in this video, we'll be taking a look at another one of his well-known works, and that is the Hamartigenia, meaning the origin of sin. And that's a piece of work where he explains the Christian view on Satan being the force behind the disturbance in an otherwise virtuous world. So Prudentius in Hamartigenia bases his position using verses in both the Old and New Testament. Firstly, the Bible claims that man is made in the image of God, and naturally this has pretty deep consequences in terms of Christian dogma. Because as soon as you agree to this, then you admit there's something special about humans, or even divine, even if it be our looks. Prudentius argued that anything God made, and especially in his image, could not by definition be evil by nature, since God could not or would not create a flawed entity based on himself. It followed that if God had created some sort of imperfection or something that could degrade into something evil, then this meant God was not the all-powerful creator that the Bible stipulated. And this could not be. And he refers to the first chapter of Genesis to confirm this. Genesis 1:31, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day." Now, if everything he had made, including humans, was very good, and then certainly there could not have been anything evil or flawed in any way in man or all of creation at this stage, even though man had been given free will. And this meant evil was not within us, so essentially the blame must lie somewhere else. Well, if God made everything good and didn't introduce an intrinsically flawed entity capable of doing evil, then something else must have introduced evil within humans, and that being, Prudentius said, was Satan. Quote, "We know a father of sin exists. We also know that he is not God at all." He then elaborates on the Christian mythology regarding Satan and makes two arguments regarding why he became the instigator of evil. Firstly, he argues Satan developed an overarching pride of himself. And secondly, Satan became jealous of the special place of humans in the hierarchy of creation. And these two combined to end in his downfall and his propensity to make mischief. So let's first go into how he developed excessive pride of himself. Quote, "But sin was not invented by God. Fallen angel conceived and birthed it in his sordid mind. Once he was a brilliant star, majestic, bright in the firmament, blaze of glory, nourished out of nothingness. For everything existing comes from nothing. All things before they were created come from nothing, and yet God is not from nothing, nor is wisdom, nor the Holy Ghost, a substance everlasting, unbegun, the one who shaped the angels of the air. Of this troop one, most beautiful of face, majestic, fierce, and grown too great in strength, became puffed up, turnescent, carrying himself too proudly, and displayed his fires with too much arrogance. Persuasively he taught that he was generated from his own powers, and from himself he drew the substance for himself, from which he first came into being, and was conceived without a maker." But if we accept this, then there are still issues. Prudentius doesn't explain how if God is created and created everything good, as it says in Genesis, and how he explained earlier, then why does this not extend to the angels who seem even more flawed and have the inclination to do evil, as with Satan and the rest of his fallen comrades who decide to follow his lead and leave heaven? Being in the presence and power of God the Almighty and their Maker seems to have no influence on their behaviour, and they decide to rebel. Surely these heavenly creatures couldn't have been created with flaws either, and especially as they dwell in heaven. And that question, in fact, could be extended to the various evil and unclean spirits that Jesus seems to exorcise from people quite often in the New Testament stories as well. His second point was the matter of Satan's envy of humans. Prudentius blames Satan's actions primarily on his inability to accept man being special, the pinnacle of the Christian God's achievement in Genesis. Quote, "Soon, though of his own free will, he sank into evil, when envy, that discoloured creature, infected him and spurred him on with bitter pricks and goads. For a spark of hate struck by envy caught and blazed, and sudden anguish ignited his impatient mind. He'd seen a simulacrum fashioned out of clay and warmed to life by God's own breath and given dominion over earth. He saw all of nature, earth and sky and ocean had learned to pour forth harvests and to give her riches liberally for the use of man, their earthly ruler. The savage beast swelled up, his heart disturbed by sour anger, and drew upon the strength within his acid marrow." So the devil, according to Prudentius, was railing at the special position of humans that the Judeo-Christian God had given to humans, having made him master of all the animals and master of the earth. And then Prudentius extrapolates on the Satan myth by describing or imagining in his mind how his physical features changed when he lost his virtue. Quote, "Once he was a stainless creature, upright wisdom kept his tall young body free of knots. But look, in sinuous curves he coils himself in new complexities and bends his shining belly in sliding spirals. His tongue, once single, now is treacherously split, and flickers with the art of varied speaking, its fissured words re-echoing. And hence the origin, the source, the fountainhead of sin. The origin of evil flowed from that prince. First, not needing any teacher, he first discovered how to ruin himself, and soon he ruined man. The world, with all the earth's resources undermined, and man, its guardian, corrupted, met its doom. In effect, we are being tempted and seduced by the devil, and any and all of our weaknesses and faults in our character can be blamed on Satan. Quote, he, meaning Satan, sows the seeds of every wickedness deep within and scatters his agents through all the body's parts. And there, enslaved to such a prince, a vast array of forces takes the field, attacks our sickened souls with dreadful weapons. Anger, superstition, grief, despair, discord, and thirst for blood, thirst for wine and thirst for gold, and spite and cunning, slander, theft, adultery, and malice, hideous with deformed faces, their every gesture threatens. Swelled ambition swaggers, learning boasts, and oratory thunders, while deceit in hiding weaves her snares. So all our weaknesses are essentially inherited from falling victim to Satan's machinations, according to Prudentius. And so once man falls prey to Satan's blandishments, then because man was made master of the earth, his fall became the precursor to the beginning of the whole world's descent into what we see today, and all the ills and issues that it faces and the problems that we have now. Quote, then it was that the malignant land from its infertile soil bore hybrid crops and flimsy burrs and weeds, and spoiled the grain with useless straw. Now savage lions learned to kill the shepherd and drain the guiltless cattle of blood, and rip apart with savage jaws young bulls already broken to the yoke. The wolf, too, irked by plaintive bleating, burst boldly into crowded pens at midnight. Skill, experienced in cruel stratagems, stained every beast, and craft honed twisted senses keen. Although a wall surrounds blooming garden or thick hedges guard the vineyard, the devastating locust will devour the budding plants, and wild birds attack and scatter clustered grapes. Why should I speak of stems of plants imbued with poison drugs whose deadly sap drips with danger? And Prudentius goes on in the following passages to name even poisonous plants, forces of nature, even storms and heavy winds, flooding of rivers as consequences of our weakness to follow Satan and commit evil. And then Prudentius, to underline the validity of his point, refers to St. Paul, who also blames dark forces for the sins of the world. And for this he uses Ephesians 6:11 and 12. Quote, Put on the whole armour of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So essentially we're in bondage to Satan for this treacherous robber, as he calls him. So needless to say, this Christian mythology of the devil being the motivational force behind every evil was completely different thinking to the Stoics or other Greek philosophies. And this was a belief essentially building on Jewish mythology of Genesis and the writings of Paul, themselves based on the Jewish scriptures. So rather than evil and sin being the fault or weakness inherent within the flawed human psyche, Prudentius argued that it was actually an external force luring innocent humans towards the rocks. So humans can almost be seen as victims rather than perpetrators, although it is nevertheless our fault through our own free will that we choose to be influenced by the devil. But we're not the sources of the original evil, and that's the crux of the matter. And this belief really, for me, has none of the optimism and progressive nature of the Greek ideas on our human flaws. For Satan, according to Christians, will always be with us, tempting us off the straight and narrow. This imaginary, supernatural evil force can always be blamed for our faults, providing an unnecessary guilty party, when the guilty party is ourselves and our own faults and our weaknesses. And on that note, I'll leave you with a thoughtful and upbeat reflection of Marcus Aurelius, who quite contrary to the Christian view that humans, animal life and the earth is corrupt and damaged because of man falling into Satan's temptations, actually interprets the world and the universe in the opposite way, that humanity and other life and the universe we live in is actually really awe-inspiring and magnificent as it is. Quote, "Dwell on the beauty of life. Watch the stars and see yourself running with them," he advises us. Finally, thanks for watching, and if you like this kind of video and other videos on this channel, then do consider liking and subscribing to help the channel out.